Okay, so let's do something here that is not going to be too fun for most people's systems. I'm here on a fairly old laptop, so I kind of know, actually, let's stay here. So I kind of know what's going to happen. I'm also being slowed down quite a bit because my graphics card is capturing the live video feed here, so that slows down Houdini quite a bit as well. So you can see when I get to 5,000, I'm kind of crawling a little bit when I start to move around. When I get to 50,000, now we're taking some time. You can see this. It's still calculating. And now just scrolling around here is pretty tough. So let's go inside here. So what's happening here with the copy stop is when I'm copying all of these objects on here, let's see if I can find it. Yes, when I'm copying them all here, each of these objects is a unique object now that is being copied. And there are unique points that we can kind of turn on and edit as needed. And I can middle mouse button over here, and you can see exactly what we've got going on here. We can also see, let's see where the memory is here. So that's using 57 megabytes of memory right now. If I turn on pack geometry before copying, it essentially is going to turn this into an instance. So when it's an instance, you can't actually go and change the internal points or attributes that are part of the geometry. So you can see that color overrides don't work here, but transformations like scale and rotation do. And our memory is a bit less as well. Now I'm still not really able to move around the viewport very well here. But that's why we can also use a view mode here as well, so that I can just view points if I want, or go back to my switch. So the reason this is a pack geometry has to do with memory and efficiency stuff. But we can also do this kind of thing here called a packed edit. So I'm pressing tab, typing packed edit. And I'm just going to put this, let's say right here. And I can change just the display of this. So I can say, give me just the bounding box, which will help a little bit. Or I can choose just the centroids, which is now really fast. And of course, when I render it, it will render exactly as it's supposed to, but it's just displaying as centroids. So you could promote this just as a display if you want. But keep in mind, again, this is real geo in here. Sorry, not when it's packed, but you can unpack this as well. You can actually do real things. This isn't actually technically instance. But I do want to show you how to do an instance correctly. So first, let's just render something really quickly, just so that I can show you. We haven't actually done rendering yet. So I'm going to make this very, very simple. I'm just going to press tab and start typing camera. This will give us a camera. I'm going to hold this down here and select the camera and click the lock button. Zoom out. So I'm holding spacebar and right clicking to zoom out. Just picking a view I like. And for now, we're not going to add any lights. We're simply just going to render. Let's go to our out tab there, and I'm going to press tab and type mantra. And this gives me a mantra ROP that we can actually render with. So currently it's set so that any object that's visible is going to render. So this is visible, these aren't, so they won't render. And it's set to look for a camera called camera 1. So I'm just going to hold this down here, and I'm just going to select mantra 1. Going to wait here for a minute. And I've got my render starting up. It takes a little bit. I'm going to allow, that's fine. And you can see that even though this is what's displayed, this is what actually gets rendered. I'm going to press escape to cancel this. Just move it out of the way. And we'll go back inside. Let's just turn that off. I'm going to wait a second here. Okay, so now if we want to actually render this as a true instance, though, there's something else we can do. If we have, up at the top level here, if we have something called an instance object, I'm going to press tab and type instance. What this does is renders stuff as an instance. I'm going to turn the geometry off. And essentially here, there's an object that you can choose. So I'm going to just select our test object. That's fine. And for point instancing, we will need to turn that on. I'm going to wait just a second before we do that. I actually want to dive inside here and turn our point count down a little bit. So whatever points are inside here are going to be replaced by this object once we turn point instancing on. And we're going to use fast point instancing. So we'll go inside. We'll delete that out and we will use an object merge. And we'll simply fetch our points. So we have our multi-scatter here, which is buried in our network, and I'm just going to grab points out. And these are our points. So the interesting thing is the way we've set this up, if we look at our spreadsheet here, we have a lot of the things that we need to render it. We have position, we have normals and rotational parameters that tell us what direction these things are going to point, and then scale parameters that tell us how big it should be. So now that we have this here, you can see that it displays in the viewport. Now this can be annoying if you've got, for instance, a million things you want to render. So what I usually do is I don't display instances, I just press D and I try to go into, let's see, what exactly is that? There it is. Under geometry, point instancing, I turn that off. You can as well turn that on and just make the percentage really low, or just set an instancing limit in terms of number of primitives that it will display. But for me, I want this to just be fast. Okay, since this is visible now, I'm going to click our render button and I will just keep that up here. So I'm just going to hold that down and select Mantra. And now you can see that it's rendering the exact same thing, just rendered as instances. So how can we get around this problem here where we can only select one object? Well, there's a way to do that. We can go into our geometry here, go into our multi-scatter, and we need to actually create an instance attribute that has a full path to the object that we want to instance onto each point. So if we give each point a different value, then we'll have a different object on the instance. So here I'm just going to place an attribute create. I'll just put that down here, and I'm going to call this instance. So our name is instance. That's a point, and this has to be a string. So what we're going to do is this. We are going to use the same setup here for our objects. Now I'm just going to copy this here. So I'm copying that parameter. And the interesting thing is this parameter's name is object path 1. That would be object path 2. And you'll see we're going to use this here. So I'm just going to paste this in as a relative reference. And if I spreadsheet that open and look at my instance here, we can see the instance. So one thing to know is when you're using instances, your path needs to be a top level path. It should be obj and then this, and then should go no further. So it's always the top level path like that. Okay, so what I want to do is be able to procedurally replace this here. So if I just delete the 1 here, and I go outside of our quote and say plus, and now let's say 2, you see now that we get the second input, sphere. So notice here the indexing starts at 1 instead of 0. So what we'll do is we will go here, and I'm just going to copy this whole thing that we've got, and we're simply going to replace the 1 by that. And instead of saying floor, we're going to say ceiling, spelled C-E-I-L, and that will give us the higher number starting with 1. So you can see here now that the instance path is changed for all of those. Now let's take a quick look at our render. And I can see we've got spheres and a bunch of other stuff. So let's do this just to make it a little more clear. We will simply, go up 1 level here. Let's just turn off density attribute so we get something similar to what we were looking at before. We'll bring the count down a little bit as well. And now we can see that it's been replaced. So it's working the way it should. Now if we want to do a little preview here in the viewport, I'm just going to press D to turn point instancing back on just so that I can kind of see what everything's looking like. We'll zoom out to something like this here. Go into our geo. Into our, there we go, instance properties. And let's just make the scale a bit smaller for all of this stuff. Maybe we'll play with the non-uniform scaling. Part of the reason that the sphere doesn't work is because it's not actually really geometry. It's just a primitive sphere. So if I change that to polygon, we should see now that that scales appropriately. And doing a quick render, you'll see that's working as it should. So I'm going to turn point instancing display back off. Now let's take a quick look in here at something like 50,000 points. So that's a lot of points. I'm going to just bring the scale down a bit here. I don't actually know what it's going to look like, but let's say that's okay. Click render. And now one thing you'll see is that we're going to have a pretty big startup time, but we can actually render 50,000. So the next optimization that we're going to need to get into is when we need to start rendering things in the millions. So we can handle 50,000 or so right now. That's really not a very big number to throw at Houdini. But when we start getting into larger numbers, we don't want huge memory spikes in render times and stuff like that. And we can kind of see what our memory is here as well. And the other interesting thing with instances is we've got to do some additional work to make them actually use the color stuff that's in here. So let's say that I grab my color map here. I'm just going to put the mandrel back. We'll render again. You can see that it doesn't work with instances. So I'm going to escape out of that. I'll show you the other non-instance method. Let's, of course, do a lot less points, maybe 1,000 total. Go back to our multi-scatter. This time go to geo out. And of course, to make this work correctly with the point colors, I need to turn off packing. Oh, one other thing as well. Currently we're rendering the instance. I need to make sure that our geometry is what's actually rendering now. Right, so now we see that we're getting color. So there's some special work that we need to do to make instances work, but you'll notice that there's a huge difference here once we start getting into, big numbers. Shall I do 50,000? Let's see what happens. So we're going to wait quite a bit of time. And let's just compare. When we were at 50,000 before, our memory usage went to 319 and we rendered in 36 seconds. Those were instances. Now we're using actual geometry. Let's see what happens here. So our render time was good because it didn't need to go through the process of creating the instances, but memory time went really high. So you can see that it's more than doubled right now, or just about doubled. So we have some additional stuff that we can definitely do, especially if we want to start rendering millions of stuff, millions of things here. So let's end this little subchapter, and then we'll start dealing with some stuff for color first before we start talking about how to render millions and millions of these objects.